he didn't get everything right. Very few presidents do. But I think that in this episode, there's a lot less suck.
I just want to play a few minutes of the 1980 Ted Kennedy campaign.
I love this.
Because I just couldn't wait to show you this.
Awesome.
So this is Ted Kennedy, who is so frustrated with Carter, he decides to run a challenge in the 1980 primary.
For no apparent reason, he opens his speech in French.
C'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui. J'étais en France pour mon service militaire, mais il y a 25 années, et maintenant, je parle anglais.
Kennedy gives one the impression that he's by no means... What do people of your generation think about Chappaquiddick? Is that a handicap?
No, I
don't think so.
I wouldn't say that extent. Although it's something that
Chappaquiddick.
Especially in politics. You want to find out your sins, go into politics.
Hey, that's dead and buried. It happened 20
at
years
the time,
ago.
they-
Let it be there. It's buried. It's nothing. Hey, probably the other people have done worse than him.
It's dead and buried like the girl he
Whatever
killed.
he says, he'll do. He won't be like Jimmy
Jesus.
Carter hide someplace.
Jimmy Carter! He won't be like Jimmy Carter. That was Rachel Dratch in that sketch with Jimmy Fallon. We just
Beautiful! It's like Hogwarts, but with more Asians.
I would be Gryffindor.
You are Hufflepuff, and you know it.
But Jimmy Carter is quite different. And he's sort of an anomaly, I think, among Democratic presidents. Or at least he's the kind of Democratic president that we don't normally come to expect. He's an anti-establishment, Southern,
Religious.
Extremely religious.
Very religious.
Yeah. Anti-racist. Pro-life.
He's so interesting.
Economically
The anti-racist-
conservative. Yeah.
He was so close on a clean bill of health in regards to his racial profile, so to say, his racial policies. And then he had that. So his first governor run, he loses, and in order to get that second run to be a success, he's like, I'm gonna sort of side with white supremacists for a bit, and then as soon as he gets elected, he's like, no, we're done.
Right.
So at least he established it right then and there, but then he also lost the quote unquote black vote later in his presidency.
Well, you know who the governor was before him?
Yeah, like a staunch segregationalist.
Lester Maddox. Yeah, exactly. Lester Maddox was famous for his appearance, on the Dick Cavett show, where he got into an argument with the football player Jim Brown.
With Jim Brown.
Yeah. But Jim Brown was there, and he got into an argument with Lester Maddox about African American rights and things like that. And Lester Maddox started talking about how he had more blacks in his cabinet than any previous governor in all the southern states. And he got so pissed off at his mistreatment by the elite liberal Dick Cavett and this African American football player Jim Brown that he walked off on the show. So that was the guy before Jimmy Carter.
Well, in Lester Maddox's defense, if you've ever watched...
Oh, God.
Wait.
You sure you want to say that?
If you've ever watched a Dick Cavett show, it's not funny.
Dick Cavett, though, he represents this kind of thing that a lot of people hate about liberals, and something that Jimmy Carter is able to capitalize on and distinguish himself from. So a lot of people in the country, kind of have this feeling about liberals that they're very stuck up, and, that a liberal is somebody who's, too smart for his own good, overeducated, and smarmy.
Overeducated, such a silly thing to hear.
Right. But Jimmy Carter does not present that kind of an image at all. He is very down to earth. That's his image. People kind of identify with him. They don't see him as initially, they don't see him as a kind of person who's talking down to them. And in light of the Republican presidents who preceded him, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, who are famous for, one is famous for disgracing the presidency and resigning, and the other is famous for pardoning him before he has to take account of any of his crimes. Jimmy Carter seems like a sort of solution to the disgrace of the American government, somebody who's going to reestablish the moral code, the moral fabric of the United States.
Now, there's definitely scandal. There's never not scandal. There's always a problem. There's always, like, bribery.
Yeah.
His brother sucks. He's an idiot. But, like, and one of his best friends who's in the cabinet sucked. But all in all, everything that he put in and everything that he did, I think was really not only important for the time, but set up the stage so that when he makes the Carter Foundation, that really, I mean, he does way more work peacekeeping and with foreign influence as the Carter Foundation than as President Jimmy Carter. But he's also, if you pay attention to his presidency, always doing more internationally than he is doing nationally. It was seen way more, he was respected way more by the international community than at home, which is why he didn't get reelected.
But here's the thing. Everything you say here, everything you just said, to me, is part of a mythology about Carter at the same time. It's not that I don't think it's true, but I also think it's part of a mythology that places Carter as this sort of
reluctant hero
ideal of what a great president could be. You know, like the president who never fired a shot, for example. That's the sort of slogan about him. But the reality is that internationally, although Jimmy Carter did have a lot of successes, he also did a lot of things that were very much in line with the suckiness of presidents that we've come to know and love on this series. In fact, I was looking through an article. I don't know if I have it up, but it was called Jimmy Carter's blood-drenched legacy.
Really?
Yes.
Put that shit up. I want to see that.
All right. He actually has a lot of really negative legacies in terms of his attitude towards other countries, his funding of right-wing dictatorships, and in particular, his national security advisor. One of the more overlooked national security advisors for people who hate Henry Kissinger.
Oh, who is that guy?
You should really look into Zbigniew Brzezinski, because this guy was really bad. He's the father of Mika Brzezinski, who is married to Joe Scarborough and is on that show Morning Joe.
Really?
Yeah.
Get out of here.
He is one of the most virulent, hawkish anti-communists that you're going to find. He came from the behind the Iron Curtain. He was just one of these people who escaped the Iron Curtain and just had this big stick up his butt about communism for his whole life and just thought anything was okay as long as it was in the interest of fighting communism.
Of course.
And Zbigniew Brzezinski even convinced Carter to sort of send some money towards anti-communist movements in Afghanistan to sort of goad the Soviet Union into fighting against into going into Afghanistan for a war. He actually literally said, you know, we are going to get the Soviet Union to collapse itself by having its own Vietnam. So he literally went out of his way to cause a Vietnam.
Did that. Okay, because I do. Yeah. That was a thing. There's so many notes. There's so many things that happened with Jimmy
I wonder if
Carter.
It's in here.
All right, I can. You want me to read it at the top?
Yeah.
All right. Starting at the top is usually good. Afghanistan, 1979. When the communist government came to power in 1978, they brought healthcare and education to a wide segment of the Afghan population. In cities such as Kabul, women enjoyed significant freedom. But this state of affairs was impermissible to the U.S. government, who sought to empower a local opposition and recruit foreign fundamentalist jihadists to join the struggle to topple the communist regime. Quote, U.S. Foreign Service officers had been meeting with
Mujahideen.
Thank you,
Yeah.
leaders to determine their need at least as early as April 1979, writes Blum. And in July, President Carter had signed a, quote, findings to aid the rebels covertly, which led to the United States providing them with cash, weapons, equipment, and supplies, and engaged in propaganda and other psychological operations in Afghanistan on their behalf. It would be another 22 years before the U.S. experienced blowback on its home soil, when one of the anti-Soviet warriors they had courted and helped train from Saudi Arabia would mastermind a plot to turn civilian airliners into missiles that were flown into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
Remember that?
No.
So yeah, not so squeaky clean, just saying.
Yeah, well, so what I was reading on Carter was that I believe, what was it, 47? Something. We had been in the Middle East for way longer than any of us had really realized. Not that Carter did, a bang-up job, but he did kind of help a bit. I mean, he did have that classic, I'm not trying to hurt anyone, I'm trying to play, all sides as long as everyone's safe and happy at the end. But it was something that, okay, here we go. Carter was blamed for Iran, but the U.S. had been in the Middle East since 1945. So there were already so many anti-American sentiments that after he has, I mean, there's some real problems he has in the Middle East when they eventually, burn effigies.
But Carter made some pretty significant mistakes in terms of his policy towards Iran. One of them was that he goes to Iran and has this big elaborate dinner with the Shah, who the United States was funding.
Yes, the Shah
and
problem.
While he's with the Shah, he gives a toast and he calls Iran an island of stability in the Middle East. And part of the reason for that is that OPEC which performed in 1960, had gotten together and decided to hike up the price of oil as a kind of punitive measure against the United States for its support of Israel during the Six-Day War. So they say, you're going to support Israel? Well, we're going to hike up the price of oil. And this causes a major disaster in the United States, which is already in the middle of stagflation, a stagnant economy with inflation. So the U.S. is doing terribly, and then the price of oil goes up. So Carter is sort of grabbing at straws, and he's, in his mind, despite his human rights agenda, forced to support this extremely repressive Shah in Iran. And then he very publicly, he goes the extra mile to sort of say, oh, we love the Shah, we love Iran, you're an island of stability. And then when the Iranian revolution takes place, the United States has absolutely no leverage in the new government that's coming.
And to make matters worse, later on, the Shah has cancer and is looking around the world for refuge and the ability to get some treatment. And, I mean, it was what I saw was to be a long conversation with his cabinet, figuring out should the Shah be let in, should the Shah not be let in. And they came to a conclusion that America, being the big superpower it is, should be able to house this man and help him because he was a world leader and he did matter and he was our friend. And after the Shah is allowed into America, all hell breaks loose in Iran with their feelings on America. And that's when a lot of that stuff really, gets going. Right after Carter, Reagan's elected, and Reagan's all about fucking Star Wars and making sure that we have this big military so no one even tries us. And a lot of anti-Islamic sentiment is born out of these people who had been oppressed by our government for so long. They were sick and tired of it, regardless of if we meant good or not, and chances are we honestly didn't. But I do know that Carter was aware of that and was generally one of the only presidents that I ever saw to say America's been wrong in the past, and America has been a bad guy, and America's been the evil empire before. I don't think I've ever seen any other president say that the amount of times and with the seriousness that Jimmy Carter has, saying that we haven't always been on the right side. And that was one thing that Americans didn't like to hear, was their president who they just elected after several presidents who I'm sure the Americans felt had disgraced them. Instead of going, you know what, you're good people, we're good people, let's go forward. He's like, we're actually bad, and we've been bad for a while. There's a lot of bad stuff going on in our country, and people didn't want to hear that.
Well, the problem for Carter is, as much as I agree with you in terms of those sentiments, and it is refreshing to watch Jimmy Carter sort of be honest about those things, the period of time in which he's saying them is a time when America seems to be in the decline. You have the Arab world, which the United States had been dominating for decades, is suddenly in the position to unite itself and to dictate terms to the United States in terms of oil price. And Carter has the American public is complaining to him every day about gas lines and prices. Oil goes into a lot more than just gas. Lots of things. The prices of a lot of things went up during the Carter administration. And it's, so for him to sort of say anything negative about the U.S. in this period of time fed even further into this narrative about Carter that he was a defeatist president, that he was shepherding America into its own decline. And some of his actions, there were some actions that Jimmy Carter took that were extremely wise and reasonable actions, like his decision to give the Panama Canal back to Panama, to give that land to Panama. But he was roasted for that decision because it fell into this narrative that Carter was a defeatist. They sort of leaned into Brzezinski's view of let's troll the Soviets instead of making peace with them, because Jimmy Carter originally engages in arms reductions with the Soviets and helps. Yes. He helps with Brezhnev. They signed the SALT II treaty, and at a certain point, the SALT II treaty, which is an arms reduction treaty, it garners a lot of criticism for Carter. He's seen as somebody who's capitulating to communism, and at a certain point, Carter actually halts the treaty in the Senate, and pulls the treaty for a moment to sort of shore up, his position as a more sort of hawkish president. Even when the Iran hostage crisis begins, his poll numbers go up. So Carter, too, is not immune from the, sweet, sweet nectar of, being a warmonger and watching your poll numbers shoot up,
Yeah.
Another question that I feel bugs a lot of people about Carter, and that is, how is it that the only president in American history who was a self-professed, born-again Christian? So there were Christian presidents, but there were none that specifically said they were born again.
And he was a Sunday school teacher, don't forget that.
Who was a Sunday school teacher. How is it that under his presidency, the Republican religious right wing came into existence? Why during his presidency, of all presidents, did it happen under his watch? Why didn't they support this Christian president? Doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, from what I gathered, it was the born-agains were never organized.
Right. Okay.
Before to rally against, but they were like, obviously we're not going to be Democrats. And they all rallied together in one party and figured out that Republicans would be the type of people who would represent their interests more. And they supported Carter. But after Carter, that was it. They were organized, they were ready, they were politically active, and they were on the right. Well, ready to go.
I actually have a couple of clips to show on that question.
Reverend Billy Graham found the evidence against Nixon profoundly disturbing and deplored the moral tone implied in the Nixon papers.
There developed in Watergate, in our audience and in the nation, a very serious distrust of government, and I don't think it's been restored yet. We don't have the bright, shiny-eyed idealism and patriotism there once was. There's a cynicism that is set in about government, and I think that it came out of that period.
Oh, this
We've
guy.
lost a great deal of confidence in some of our institutions. There's been a moral permissiveness that has frightened millions of people. Some deeper national yearning in the country, a turning towards spirituality, a yearning for morality. And now in the realm of politics, it has come into discussion. Americans want more than anything else this
Football
year
stadium.
in their president, the spiritual quality.
The Kingdom.
The most important thing in my life is Jesus Christ.
He was highly regarded by the evangelicals in those early days.
And I formed a very close, intimate, personal relationship with God through Christ that has given me a great deal of peace, equanimity, the ability to accept difficulties without unnecessarily being disturbed. The Supreme Court has drawn a line, the right of a woman to have control over her own body. I support the ruling and will enforce it to the best of my ability.
I react. I react to the burning of the American flag. I react to the assassination attempts on the Constitution of the United States. I react to irresponsible voting in Congress, to the blatant compromise with communism, to prayer removed from our schools.
This
Brother,
guy
I'm
in
ready to
it.
do something about it. Amen and amen.
Amen.
And we all
I
made a
react.
commitment to God that day. For the first
James
time
Robinson.
in our lives, we were going to get involved in the political process and do everything we could to wake up the Christians. So I stood there and I prayed.
Who is this guy?
prayer.
I'm not
I
sure.
said, oh God, we have got to get this man out of the White House and get someone in here who will be aggressive about bringing
He looks
back
like Donald
traditional
Glover in
moral
Whiteface,
values.
if you've seen
I happen to
that
believe
episode
from
on Atlanta.
all the study that I have been able to do, all the information I've been able to get, that when you interrupt a pregnancy, you are taking a human life. Now, that puts that human life within the protection of the Constitution, the guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So they turned away from Carter pretty quickly. I mean, Reagan picks it up very astutely. You know, if he can take the mantle of Christianity away from Jimmy Carter, you know, the religious right will swing to him. Now, it's interesting because Jimmy Carter supported the Hyde Amendment, which prevented the government from funding abortion services for women. So he really wasn't as pro-abortion of a president as the religious right made him out to be. Neither was Ronald Reagan as anti-abortion of a president as he made himself out to be. He appointed Sandra Day O'Connor, who had a pretty interesting pro-choice record, to the Supreme Court. And another big issue was prayer in schools. There were some Supreme Court cases where they were trying to get prayer in schools sort of banned. And Ronald Reagan promised Jerry Falwell that he would support an amendment to the Constitution that would prevent school prayer from being, you know, stopped or ended or interrupted, that people would be allowed to pray in school. And when he got elected, Reagan basically made a very symbolic sort of go at it, and it didn't work, and he said, you know, oops, oh well, it's not working, moving on now. So in a lot of ways, you know, these people who ran to Ronald Reagan hoping that he would sort of be their savior, Reagan didn't really deliver that much for them.
In Sandra Day O'Connor's defense, she and her son were sent back in time to save us all. Her son, of course, John Day O'Connor, to eliminate all the problems.
All right. So, yeah, so, you know, it kind of speaks to what you were talking about earlier as well. It was sort of, there is this sense that, you know, sure, Jimmy Carter may have been himself a religious person, But we've seen, Jerry Falwell Jr., for example, when Donald Trump ran for president, gave a speech where he said, "We are not electing a pastor, we are electing a president." And so this idea of realism sort of sets into the religious right, where it's suddenly not so important, especially after Carter, to elect a pious or spiritual individual to the presidency, but to elect somebody who will accomplish the right-wing Christian agenda, which means anti-abortion, anti-feminism. Sometimes it mixes with racism as well, but a lot of these religious right people are not as racist as you would imagine, I must say, to be fair. And anti-communism, anti-left-wing, pro-business, pro-cut taxes agenda, which is interesting because I found that Jimmy Carter was not that liberal either in terms of his economic policies.
Yeah, there's a few things that he cut that he really shouldn't have cut. Like
a lot of budget
social
cuts,
programs,
a lot of budget cuts and social and regulations. Yeah, go ahead, go for it.
Well, so as you guys are probably aware, there was a bunch of inflation, stagflation, which is what we were talking about. It's a really big deal if you ever pay attention to any politics shows or politics classes. And one of the biggest problems was that he decided to fix the inflation by cutting social programs. So those who are being affected most by inflation are no longer going to be receiving aid at all. So it's pretty much, I mean, in my opinion, akin to the Ronald Reagan, go fuck yourself, mentally handicapped people. It's like, go fuck yourself if you don't have enough money. We're just not going to try and help you. And by putting you down, hopefully everyone else goes up. And that's really rough.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of the so-called Reaganomics policies that would become standard fare in the 1980s were already getting underway during the Carter administration. And you could argue that Carter did just as much to break the New Deal liberal consensus that had existed since Franklin Roosevelt. It did just as much to break that consensus with his conservative policies as Ronald Reagan did. And in fact, during one of his State of the Union speeches in 1978, Carter said something that I wish I could find the quote.
Government cannot solve our problem. It can't set our goals. It cannot. Where further delay will only lead to more harsh and painful solutions, wage and price increases in each of the sectors. Well, okay, that's a run-on sentence. I don't have an end for it. Sorry.
Yeah, they said he was
but
Wilsonian.
It was by Carter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Reagan just sort of took that and made it much more concise. Government isn't the solution to our problems. Government is the problem.
Whoa.
Yeah.
This is a really, really long speech.
Because we have not yet talked about the elephant in the room.
You go
Jimmy
for that.
Carter's wonderful brother, Billy Carter.
Yeah.
So first thing I want to do is I want to play a video of some behind the scenes.
Is it going to be Billy and a good friend of his?
We'll talk about the good friend of his at the end of this video for sure. Here's some footage. Just give you a sense. Jimmy Carter had a brother named Billy Carter. So basically, when Jimmy Carter was nominated, he was sort of a political unknown. People didn't really know much about him. So reporters go down to his hometown of Plains, Georgia, a very small town, looking for information about Jimmy Carter. And they bump up against this guy, Billy Carter, his brother, who is sort of an outspoken, beer-drinking, unapologetic redneck who runs the gas station in town. And they find a gold mine in this guy. He is a character. And so he sort of becomes the big celebrity of Jimmy Carter's presidency. And this guy cashes in big time, okay?
In Louisville, it's beer. In Nashville,
Great
it's a
sound.
syndicated TV show.
Billy, I'm going to give you a little advice. While we're up here in Cornfield County, don't you date Lisa Tarr. Her neck's dirty. Her does.
What is this?
I'm glad to be here and with Piggy's Pizza, and believe it or not, I tried it down home.
Billy.
Down home, that is until Jimmy became president.
I'm a brother of the president.
He went national, becoming the nation's first brother and a hot new promotional property complete with a show business manager and a new business card. Since March, when his road show began, Billy has visited 17 states, often in 2- and 3-day appearances. He travels first class, accompanied by an assistant, and while working, 2 bodyguards.
Wow.
Billy
Yeah.
will earn $500,000
What a cool
this year.
dude.
Did you hear that? He earns $500,000 compared to the presidential salary of $200,000.
About $5,000 and more for attending promotions, stock car races, and judging contests like the World.
Oh, the belly flop contest!
Over British Columbia, where he
There's it. That's him belly flopping.
Quiet, please. A little feeling in
What? How do you win?
I have no. It's just like a judge thing. They had judges, and he was one of the judges. Oh, this is good. Are you ready for this?
Oh, this is gonna get gross for sure.
Woo!
What? Who was that singing?
I have no idea. Potato sag race. I know you're on a delay a little bit, but...
Yeah.
But I still can't figure out what to do with the outside of a peanut. That's the whole problem.
What is that joke? So, Billy Carter became known as the most famous beer drinker in the United States, and he even had brewed his own beer called Billy Beer, and there it is right there.
Billy.
So basically, and this is an interesting story. So Billy Carter became famous as a beer drinker, the beer drinking redneck. And there was this brewery, I think it was in Michigan, that was basically about to close down. It was on its last legs. And Billy Carter bought the place, and they decided to call it Billy Beer. And it was one of the biggest rollouts of a beer you could ever imagine. Lots of people bought this beer. It had on the can, "I've had this beer brewed up just for me. I think it's the best beer I've ever tasted. And I've tasted a lot. I think you'll like it too." Signed by Billy Carter. Apparently it was shite. It was terrible. And the problem, it quickly failed because Billy Carter would get drunk and talk about how terrible Billy Beer tasted. And how he was...
Incredible.
Yeah. There's a great quote from Billy Carter here. This is "I got a redneck, white socks, and blue ribbon beer." That was Billy Carter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Which quote do you think is better, that one or when he says, "I accepted a bribe from the Liberian government"? Which quote?
Libyan.
Do you like?
Libyan. Yeah.
Libyan.
Y'all know who Muammar Gaddafi is?
Yeah. Remember that guy that got Gaddafi'd?
He gave a loan of $200,000 to Billy Carter, and Billy signed up as an agent of the Libyan government at one point.
Cool guy.
Yeah. That got Jimmy Carter in a lot of hot water as well. I did hear a few good Billy Carter jokes as well, so if you're interested, this was what one of the Billy Carter jokes I heard was, why does Billy Carter always keep his fly unzipped?
Why?
In case he needs to count to 11. Because
he's stupid?
Yeah.
And I only see 10 fingers.
How do you find Billy Carter's nose?
How?
Kick a Libyan in the ass.
What? I get it, but wow.
Yeah. So that sort of became the thing. Billy Carter also got in some hot water for saying some really nasty thing about Jews at one point, which really complicated Jimmy Carter's relationship with Israel.
Ah, yes. The Camp David Accords that took forever.
Yeah, it's one of the Camp David Accords. Probably has to be said of all the
great successes.
One of the great successes in presidential diplomacy that I can possibly think of. In fact, I would argue that the West Wing episode, which takes place at Camp David, is largely based on trying to recreate the Camp David Accords. I'd say that I can't think of a more dramatic, more long-lasting peace concluded at a summit than the Camp David Accords concluded by Jimmy Carter.
So the Camp David Accords were two. You had what the hell were their names? I didn't write their names down. Oh, you had Sadat.
Mm-hmm.
Who was the other guy?
Menachem Begin.
Yes.
The Israeli leader, Menachem Begin.
The Israeli leader and then the Egypt leader. And they were not friends. And not only were they not friends, but Carter had to individually talk to each leader in most of the Camp David time that they had because they wouldn't talk to each other. They wouldn't sit down. They wouldn't agree to anything. But by the end of it, Carter he put his money where his mouth was, and he got it done, and he signed a peace agreement, which allowed Israel to become a state and Benjamin Netanyahu to do what he's been doing for the past 10 years.
Yeah. Well, he got, and part of what he got was the Israelis. There was a war during the Nixon administration between the Israelis and the Egyptians in which the Israelis occupied the Sinai Peninsula. And part of the agreement was the Israelis agreed to pull out of the Sinai Peninsula, which, as you may have noticed if you looked at a map lately, is part of Egypt. So that was during the Carter administration. So that was sort of a preventative measure because Israel and Egypt had fought many wars up to that point, and since then they have not fought against each other in any wars.
But it is really rough to go, hey, here's a white guy from another country. He's going to tell us what our land dispute is, or he's going to settle the land dispute for us and tell us where we're supposed to live, which was exactly the problem with what Western Europe did during the very end of World War II, going, okay, you need to pay reparations, Oh, you're going to get this part of Africa. This part of Africa is going to be sectioned off. I mean, it's a problem when you tell people what's what and where they live and you've never been there before.
Yeah, that's true. And I think Carter got a little bit too big for his britches after those accords because he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And that gave him a sense that if he stuck his nose in basically any conflict, he could be of service. And it wasn't always the case, in particular in Iran, which the Iranian Revolution sort of rained on the Camp David Accords parade, because it happened very shortly after that was concluded. And Jimmy Carter decided, hey, well, we're going to help out some of these moderates and liberals in Iran to build a power base in the new Iranian government. And all that did was give Ayatollah Khomeini and the radical Islamists something to point to say, look at those liberals, they're in league with the United States. And that, I know people who were part of the liberal side of that revolution who had to leave Iran and who lost everything because of the Ayatollah taking command. Although, from what I've heard, the Ayatollah actually did set up a kind of two-tiered system in which there was, at least for an Islamic republic, a sort of separation of church and state. There is a secular side to that government, as well as a religious side. So he turned out to be a little more moderate than people thought he would be. He was also anti-communist, so he sort of put Iran in this position, which it's in today, where Iran is friends with neither the Soviet Union or the United States. Which is why they've had why they've been such a focal point of so many international conflicts and and dramas, and why people think Iran is one of those places that a World War III, could start because of Iran.
The second day of office, Carter pardoned all Vietnam evaders. It was a war we shouldn't have been in. The government's telling people we got ourselves into a war and I'm going to make your children go to war for us. And Carter pardoned those who didn't want to sacrifice their life for a lie. And that's pretty dope. I like that a lot. I think
he also pardoned somebody else. Do you know who?
I don't think I have it written down, no.
Jimmy Carter pardoned the President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis.
Really?
Yes.
What?
But anyway. Yeah, he pardoned the Vietnam, the draft dodgers, so to speak. I think it was his like first official act. It was like the day after he was inaugurated.
Yeah, second day in office.
Yeah.
The other thing, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Argo. I haven't. But so the Iranian deal, obviously there were hostages. Obviously it was not the best handling on the part of Carter and his people. However, he got the hostage situation taken care of. None of them died. There was no war. There was not real conflict. I mean, there was a complete loss of the confidence of Americans, and he really, really was looking bad. I mean, there was a point in Carter's presidency where his approval rating was lower than Nixon at the time of Watergate. He was at, I believe, 25% or something ridiculously low.
Was that after the Malaise speech?
Yeah, so the Malaise speech is Jimmy Carter was supposed to tell everyone, like, hey, we need to come together as a country, and instead he did something that he did kind of often. He blamed the American people for being selfish and greedy and not doing enough for their country, which he's not wrong, but also you're the president, fix shit, and don't tell people. You tell them how to act better instead of just say, you should be using less, you should be doing less, you're bad.
Yeah.
But the really impressive thing was, he stayed up literally all night the night before Reagan was inaugurated, and he made sure that deal got done, and that deal was announced a minute after Reagan was inaugurated. And the reason for that, I'm sure from the other government, was to go, we do not approve of Jimmy Carter. Our people don't approve of Jimmy Carter, but we need to make good with America before crazy Star Wars man comes up. He improved our relations with China, North Korea, and the Middle East at the time.
Right.
I like we were just saying, he had problems with Iran. There were a lot of other things going on, but that the Camp David Accords were really, really important. He opened up ties with China, and he was the only president to be in North Korea that I'm aware of.
Bill Clinton went. You mean while he was president?
While he was president,
yeah.
And he went.
Well, wait, no. Donald Trump, man, come on.
Did he go to North Korea?
He crossed the DMZ.
Ugh, I hate him so much.
Little Rocket Man.